Good morning, friends. We've been talking for several weeks, or at the very least alluding to, the judgment that was going to come on the nation of Israel in the first century. Jesus pronounces the woes upon the scribes and Pharisees, and as we'll see in a couple weeks, he goes on to make it clear that the judgment won't merely be on the scribes and Pharisees, but on the whole nation, since the general population of Israel was indeed engaging in the same kind of rebellion against God as their religious leaders were. And even though we've barely dipped our toe into what that judgment is going to be like, we've already seen that it was going to be significant and is going to be severe. And in light of that, I'd like to take a moment today to draw a rather sharp and hopefully welcome distinction between the judgment of God and the discipline of God. Because for a reminder, we saw that the severity of God's judgment concerning Israel in the first century is demonstrated in how Jesus essentially gives them over to their own sinful desires. He tells the scribes and Pharisees to fill up the measure of their fathers. In essence, to just cut out the hypocrisy part and just show their true colors. Go ahead and indulge themselves in their rebellion and rejection of both God and the people that God was sending to tell them the truth. And we saw that this is something that God, in fact, does do. There are times, actually, as an act of mercy, if we look at the opposite side, as an act of mercy, there are times that God literally restrains people from sinning. Think about how in the book of Genesis, God kept Abimelech, King Abimelech, from sinning by taking Abraham's wife Sarah into his household as his own wife. That would have been a grievous sin because Sarah was Abraham's wife. And yet, because of a big long story there and some deception, Abimelech didn't really understand who Sarah was and who Abraham was in relationship to each other. And so Abimelech took Sarah into his own household, but God prevented him from having the physical relationship that people usually have with people that they take to be their wife. And so prevented him from bringing guilt on himself. And so Abimelech essentially remained innocent and was not judged by God because he did not sin. But it was God himself who kept him, restrained him from sinning. But on the flip side, back to the judgment part, there are times when God actually judges people by removing his hand of restraint from them, where he actually allows them and does not prevent them from doing all the evil that is in their hearts. Now, to clarify, this does not mean that God is the one forcing them to do evil or that God is somehow himself morally culpable for the evil that they do. Not at all. He isn't forcing them to do anything. He's not the one putting the evil into their minds to do that evil. No, the evil is already there and they already want to perpetrate it. And so as an act of judgment against them, God allows them to fill up the measure of their evil, to continue in sin and rebellion against God, and so pile up their own kind of weight of wrath that God will then justly bring against them on the day of ultimate judgment, which is a terrifying thought, isn't it? Because the judgment of God is overwhelming and truly a thing to be feared. But as we transition into thinking about God's discipline, let me ask you this, particularly if you are a child of God, if you're a Christian. When we think about the judgment of God, do we as Christians need to live in fear of that judgment? Now, we fear the Lord in one sense, yes, but that sort of fear in terms of the terror of the Lord or his judgment, as it were, may be what drives us to the Lord to seek his mercy so that we are not judged, right? But that kind of fear, terror is not what sustains us in our relationship with the Lord. Because having been brought into the household of God, that fear becomes it does not remain a terror, so to speak, but it becomes a sort of reverence and awe. Not the terror of wrathful judgment, but the intense and sober respect in recognizing who God is and yet who we are in comparison. And that if it were not for his grace and mercy, we would only have the terror to hold on to. On this matter, consider what the Apostle Paul says. He says, "For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God." You see, when we were slaves to sin, we had every reason for that sort of terror or fear. For in that case, there is only the expectation of overwhelming judgment, and God is a consuming fire. But as we come to Christ in faith by the power of God's gracious purposes that work within us through the Holy Spirit, we are adopted into God's own household, such that we can call him legitimately and personally Abba, Father. So we no longer have the terror fear of the one who is under condemnation, but we have the awe and reverence and respect of the child who is so grateful to have been adopted as an actual child of God Most High. And in that adoption, being a child of God, we will never experience God's judgment, ever, but we will experience his discipline. And as bad of a rap as that word has gotten in our modern culture, this is an incredibly good thing. Because as we learn in the book of Hebrews, God disciplines those he loves, as any good earthly father will. Actually, because fathers in our broader society are not a great example of discipline, let's consider a good coach of whatever kind of sports team you might want to consider. I, for a very short time, played football, so let me use a football coach for this illustration. A good coach disciplines his players through workouts and exercises, running drills over and over to build muscle memory of whatever the activity might be. And yes, when players do something wrong, they make a mistake, they don't remember the play or, whatever it is, there might be discipline in terms of correction and reinforcing the right way to do things. But all of it is for the player's good. Is to train them, to strengthen them, to develop their skills so that they can play the game, be competitive, and even win. And obviously, again, God is not the coach of a competitive sports team, but he does discipline us for our good in a similar way. He trains us and he orchestrates situations in our lives that absolutely will be difficult, just as a coach prepares difficult tasks for his players to engage in for the sake of training, for the sake of giving experience and building, back to God, building our spiritual muscles of faith. We grow stronger and wiser. And sticking with this coach metaphor for a second longer, through God's discipline, we end up learning his game plan better and better, and which helps us to understand why we're going through the training and the discipline that we are. But as we gain the long-term perspective and purpose of it, that develops a growing willingness in us to be disciplined, to be trained, so that we actually willingly and even eagerly enter into that discipline and training rather than resisting and fighting it. Because it is true. Think about, let me quote the passage in Hebrews I alluded to earlier. It goes like this: "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Just think about that. If God didn't discipline us, it would actually be like he's just letting us go. And that sounds more like the judgment we talked about earlier, doesn't it? But when you feel the hand of God's discipline on you, perhaps you do know that you've sinned and you need to be corrected. And so the sin has occurred. You're experiencing its destructive consequences in your life. You're feeling the Spirit's conviction. Yes. That's God's discipline. Does it feel good? No. In the moment, like the scriptures just said, in the moment, no, it doesn't feel good. It feels painful. But if we allow ourselves to be trained by it, to admit our sin, seek the Lord's forgiveness, which we will certainly receive, then we will be trained in the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Okay, to use another illustration, We know from Christ that all who belong to the Lord are in the palm of his hand, and he will not let us go. He will not cast us aside himself. He will not let anyone else snatch us from our hands. But when we, even as Christians, as his children, if we rebel, it's like we get up from the center of the palm of his hand and we go and we stand on the edge of his hand. Now, he's not going to let us fall over the edge. We are perfectly secure because we belong to our Father, and he's not going to let us go. He loves us that much. But still, we're not in the center of his palm. So he trains us, he disciplines us to bring us back away from the edge to back to the center, because that's where the peace is. That's where the peaceful fruit of righteousness is. And so when you experience God's discipline, and it may not be because you've done anything wrong, maybe it's just a period of training that all God's people go through to get stronger. Right. I mean, I think back to when I was that single year I was in football. It felt like my coach hated me. But because we had to run laps, and it wasn't because we did anything wrong. It was just part of the training. It was part of the discipline. It was also the reason why I went to the golf team the next year. But the point is that the football coach wasn't hating us. It was for our good, to make us stronger, faster, have more endurance for when it came to game time. It was for our good. Okay. And God trains us so that for our good as well, to grow us spiritually, to strengthen us for whatever lies ahead. And the thing that will help you to endure those growth sessions of training is the knowledge that you being in that growth session, you being in that training and under that discipline of the Lord, is a sign of his love for you. Because again, if he didn't love you, if you were not his illegitimately adopted child, he would just let you go. He wouldn't care. He wouldn't bother trying to train you to make you stronger or build you up for a purpose. But when you experience his discipline, whether it's just that spiritual strength training or he's bringing you up short because of specific sin, either way, be encouraged when it happens, especially when you're thinking it's too hard, it's too difficult, it feels like God is angry with me, it feels like he's cast me aside, doesn't care about me. Because the truth is that if you're experiencing God's discipline, just the opposite is true. It is actually proof that he has not cast you aside, and he never will, because he does care about you, and he's treating you like one of his own sons, legitimate and loved, and never to be cast aside. So let us recognize the difference between the judgment and the discipline of God. Let us be thankful that as the children of God, we will never actually face the judgment of God. And when we face this discipline of God, we actually have every reason to be thankful, even in the midst of that. With that, let me say that I love you. I pray that you have a good and godly day. And if the Lord wills, I will see you soon.